I am Paul, 65 years old, and a structural engineer who spent decades building bridges across the Atlantic. But nothing prepared me for the day I had to tear down the very foundation of my own family to save my daughter. I flew in from Britain unannounced to surprise my daughter and her husband. Imagine my horror when I found the main house empty and a heavy iron padlock securing the windowless garage. When I broke it open, I did not find boxes. I found my brilliant 32-year-old daughter chained to a concrete pillar, whispering that her husband and his mother did this to her. Before I continue this story, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a father's love will burn down the world to protect his child. The Seattle rain was relentless as I pulled my rental truck into the pristine driveway of the suburban estate. I had just terminated my lucrative 3-year engineering contract in London a full month early. Something in my gut had been twisting for weeks. During our weekly Sunday video calls, Rachel had looked increasingly hollow. Her bright eyes were dulled, her vibrant energy replaced by a mechanical, exhausted cadence. Colin, her husband, and a prominent city prosecutor always dominated the screen. He would gently rub her shoulders and explain to me that the demands of motherhood and her new freelance consulting business were just wearing her down. He played the perfect supportive husband. I wanted to surprise them, to take my grandson Leo to the park, to cook a real meal for my daughter, and let her sleep for a weekend. I stepped out of the truck, expecting the usual chaotic signs of a house with a toddler. But the yard was immaculate, sterile. There were no plastic trucks on the lawn, no chalk drawings on the driveway. The massive house sat in eerie, perfect silence. I walked up the stone path and rang the doorbell. Nothing. I knocked on the heavy oak door. Silence. A strange, cold apprehension settled in my chest. Colin's luxury sedan was missing, but Rachel's compact SUV was parked near the side fence. She had to be home. As I walked around the perimeter of the main house to check the backyard, I heard it. A rhythmic, metallic scraping sound. It was faint, muffled by the heavy rain, but distinct. It was not coming from the house. It was coming from the detached, windowless garage at the far end of the property. I approached the structure. It was an oversized, reinforced building Colin had insisted on constructing 2 years ago, claiming he needed a secure space for his classic car restoration hobby. As I got closer, the scraping sound stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic wheezing. I reached the side entry door. There was no standard doorknob. Instead, a heavy-duty commercial-grade combination padlock secured a thick steel hasp. My engineering mind immediately flagged the anomaly. You do not secure a hobby garage from the outside with a lock designed for shipping containers unless you are trying to keep something completely trapped inside. I did not shout. I did not call out Rachel's name. I walked swiftly back to my rental truck, opened the toolbox I always traveled with, and pulled out a solid steel crowbar. I returned to the garage door, wedged the forged tip of the crowbar under the mounting bracket of the hasp, planted my boots against the wet siding, and threw my entire body weight backward. The wood splintered with a loud crack, and the metal bracket tore free from the door frame. The padlock hit the concrete with a heavy thud. I pulled the heavy door open. The stench hit me like a physical blow. It was a thick, suffocating wave of ammonia, stale sweat, and decay. The garage was pitch black. I fumbled for the wall switch and flicked it upward. A row of harsh motion-activated fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating the nightmare. There was no classic car. There were no tools. The concrete floor was bare except for a stained mattress in the center of the room. Lying curled on that mattress was my daughter. Rachel, the brilliant woman who had graduated at the top of her university class, was practically unrecognizable. She was skeletal, her collarbones protruding sharply beneath a filthy, torn sweater. Her face was a canvas of fading yellow and deep purple bruises, but the most horrifying detail was at her feet. A thick industrial steel chain was wrapped tightly around her left ankle, securing her directly to the primary load-bearing beam of the garage. The skin around the metal was rubbed raw and infected. The rhythmic scraping I had heard was the sound of her desperately trying to drag the heavy chain across the concrete. I dropped the crowbar and fell to my knees beside her. Her skin was freezing. I gathered her frail upper body into my arms, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. Her eyes fluttered open. They were bloodshot and unfocused, completely blown wide with terror until she recognized my face. A weak, broken sob escaped her cracked lips. "Who did this?" I asked, my voice trembling with a rage I had never known existed. I reached for my phone to dial emergency services. Her cold, bony fingers weakly grabbed my wrist, stopping me. She shook her head frantically. The panic in her eyes was absolute. "No police," she whispered, her voice barely a dry rasp. "He owns them." "Who, Rachel? Tell me who." "It is Colin," she choked out, tears finally spilling over her bruised cheeks. "Colin and his mother, Diane. They took my baby dad. They took Leo." The words paralyzed me. The perfect son-in-law, the respected city prosecutor who put criminals behind bars, the wealthy, high-society mother-in-law who hosted charity galas. They had locked my flesh and blood in a concrete box to rot. 1,000 questions raced through my mind. Why? How long? Where was my grandson? My mind raced to assemble the pieces of this horrific puzzle. The fatigue on the video calls was not motherhood. It was starvation. It was systematic, calculated torture happening right under my nose while I was thousands of miles away building bridges. I pulled off my heavy jacket and wrapped it tightly around her shivering shoulders. "We are leaving right now," I promised her, my voice turning to cold steel. "I am going to break this chain, and then I am going to break them." But before I could reach for the crowbar to attack the chain links, the environment shifted. A sharp electronic beep echoed from the ceiling. The motion sensor lights above us abruptly clicked off, plunging us back into the suffocating darkness. A second later, the deep mechanical grinding of gears outside broke the silence. I gently laid Rachel back down and rushed to the open door, looking out into the rain. The heavy wrought iron electronic driveway gate at the street entrance was slowly rolling shut, locking my rental truck inside the perimeter. We were no longer just discovering a crime scene. We were officially trapped inside one. I gathered my daughter into my arms. She weighed almost nothing. Her fragile bones pressed sharply against my chest as I carried her out of that toxic concrete box. The heavy iron gate at the end of the driveway was already halfway closed, the gears grinding relentlessly in the heavy Seattle rain. I placed Rachel gently across the back seat of my rental truck, wrapping my thick work coat securely around her shivering body. I slammed the driver door shut, threw the transmission into gear, and pressed the gas pedal flat against the floorboards. The heavy engine roared. Metal screeched violently against metal as the thick steel grille of my truck smashed directly through the wrought iron gate. The sheer impact shattered both my front headlights instantly. The gate buckled, snapped off its hinges, and gave way. I was out on the dark suburban street, driving completely blind into the stormy night. I knew with absolute certainty that I could not take her to the local hospital. Colin was not just a lawyer. He was the deputy district attorney for the entire city. He had spent the last 5 years building a terrifyingly untouchable reputation in the courthouse. He dined with the chief of police on weekends. He played golf with the senior judges. He controlled the narrative of the city. If I walked into the local emergency room with his battered, emaciated wife, his people would lock down the building before a doctor even looked at her. They would arrest me for kidnapping under some fabricated warrant, and Rachel would disappear back into his custody forever. I had to think like an engineer building a bridge over unstable ground. I needed an off-the-grid solution. I needed a place outside his jurisdiction. 30 miles outside the city limits sat a private trauma center, hidden in an industrial park. I knew about this facility from my early days managing heavy construction crews near the shipyards. When a steelworker took a bad fall off the books, or a crane operator needed discreet medical attention, that is exactly where we went. They asked no questions as long as the cash was good. I steered the battered, headlightless truck onto the deserted coastal highway, relying purely on the dim, amber glow of the streetlights and the lightning flashes to guide me. In the back seat, Rachel was completely silent. Her breathing was so shallow and uneven that I had to keep reaching my hand back just to feel the faint pulse at her cold neck. Every single mile felt like an agonizing eternity. I pushed the heavy engine as fast as I dared in the pitch-black rain, praying constantly that I would not get pulled over by a state trooper. We reached the private clinic just past midnight. I carried Rachel through the automatic sliding glass doors and slammed my high-limit corporate credit card directly onto the front reception desk. I demanded their absolute best trauma physician, immediately stating that money was no object. The triage nurses took one look at her bruised skeletal body and immediately rushed her into a secure private trauma bay in the back of the building. I stood in the corner of the blindingly white hospital room, my clothes completely soaked in freezing rain, and my hands shaking uncontrollably with pure adrenaline. A tall, gray-haired doctor rushed into the room and immediately began examining her vitals. The doctor drew several vials of dark blood from her frail arm and ran them straight through a rapid toxicology testing machine located in the corner of the trauma bay. The machine hummed and clicked for 10 agonizing minutes. When the final paper results printed out, all the color completely drained from the seasoned doctor's face. He turned to me with an expression of pure, unfiltered shock. He said, "She has not just been starved and dehydrated." He pointed to the chemical breakdown on the paper. He said her entire nervous system is completely saturated with military-grade synthetic paralytics. The specific drug they were pumping into her veins keeps the victim entirely conscious and aware of their surroundings, but completely unable to move their muscles voluntarily. It was a chemical straitjacket designed for extreme interrogations. The doctor asked me in a horrified whisper, what kind of absolute monster would systematically do this to a human being? Before I could even formulate an answer to his question, a sharp, vibrating buzz cut right through the sterile quiet of the medical room. It was coming from the deep pocket of my wet jacket. When I was carrying Rachel out of that dark, putrid garage, I had spotted a sleek silver cell phone lying discarded on the damp concrete floor. I had shoved it into my pocket on pure instinct, hoping it held evidence. I pulled the device out now. The glass screen was cracked across the middle, but the caller identification text was clearly visible. It flashed the name Diane. Colin's wealthy high society mother, the ruthless matriarch of their twisted, arrogant family. I signaled the trauma doctor to remain completely silent. I swiped my thumb across the cracked glass to accept the call and lifted the phone slowly to my ear. I did not speak a single word. I just listened to the steady static of the connection. On the other end of the line, Diane spoke in a cold, impatient, and utterly sneering tone. She completely assumed I was her son on the other end. She asked if he had finished scrubbing the garage floor yet. She complained that the luxury real estate appraiser was arriving tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. Her voice grew even colder as she commanded him to make sure there was absolutely no trace of the freak left on the property before they finalized the multi-million-dollar sale. The freak. That is exactly what this polished, wealthy woman called the beautiful mother of her own biological grandson. The sheer sociopathic calculation of her words made the blood freeze in my veins. This was not a crime of passion or a sudden violent outburst. They had planned this execution perfectly. They had systematically isolated my daughter, paralyzed her with untraceable military drugs, and were now actively preparing to sell her beautiful family home right out from under her while she slowly rotted away in a locked concrete cell. They were erasing her entire existence for profit. I quietly pressed the red button to end the call. The cracked screen went completely dark in my hand. I looked over at the trauma doctor, who was now rapidly preparing a massive syringe full of a chemical counteragent to slowly neutralize the dangerous paralytic in Rachel's bloodstream. The terrifying pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place in my mind. The imported drugs, the forced isolation, the sudden rushed real estate sale. I needed to move incredibly fast. If the property appraiser was scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning, that meant Colin would be driving back to that dark garage tonight to finish his grim task. He was going to find the splintered wood. He was going to find the broken steel lock. He was going to find the empty iron chain on the floor. And the exact moment that corrupt prosecutor realized his victim had escaped, he would weaponize the entire police force to hunt us down before the sun even came up. I saved the audio file of Diane to my secure cloud server before the screen of the cracked phone could even fade to black. My thumb hovered over the device. That single minute of audio was the first real weapon I had in a war I did not even know I was fighting. The trauma doctor was still working frantically over my daughter, adjusting intravenous drips and monitoring the steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart machine. The clinical scent of iodine and bleach filled my lungs. I stepped out of the blindingly bright trauma bay and walked down the dimly lit, completely empty hospital corridor. I needed someone who operated outside of normal jurisdiction. I needed my corporate attorney. His name was Warren. He was a viciously smart legal bulldog based in Chicago who handled my massive international engineering contracts. He was the kind of man who did not sleep, who thrived on dismantling complex problems, and who answered his phone on the very first ring, regardless of the time zone. When he picked up, I did not bother with pleasantries. I kept my voice low and completely steady, though my hands were still shaking with residual adrenaline. I told him I needed him to immediately draft and file federal aggravated assault and kidnapping charges. I told him to target Colin, the deputy district attorney of Seattle, and his mother, Diane. I expected Warren to ask for the details, to demand the location of the evidence, and to start making the ruthless phone calls he was famous for. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the phone line. I could hear the rapid clicking of Warren typing on a mechanical keyboard in the background. When he finally spoke, his voice did not have its usual aggressive confidence. It was tight, cautious, and completely filled with dread. The words he spoke next chilled the blood in my veins, far more than the freezing rain outside ever could. He told me he could not file the charges. He told me I could not go to the police. I demanded to know why. I told him I had Rachel in a private trauma center right now filled with military-grade paralytics and starved to the bone. I told him I had a recorded confession of Diane treating her like a piece of garbage to be disposed of. I told him we had all the physical proof we needed to lock them both in a concrete cell for the rest of their miserable lives. Warren stopped typing. He took a deep breath. He explained that Colin had completely anticipated every single possible legal angle. 4 days ago, while I was completely oblivious and packing my bags in Britain, Colin had walked into a closed-door family court hearing. He used his immense influence and power as a senior prosecutor to bypass standard waiting periods. He filed an emergency temporary medical conservatorship over Rachel. In the official court documents, Colin claimed under oath that his wife had suffered a sudden, violently dangerous drug-induced psychotic break. He claimed she was a severe threat to herself and to their young child. And because Colin was a respected officer of the court, the presiding judge signed the order without demanding a secondary medical evaluation. The legal reality crashed over me like a collapsing steel beam. A conservatorship meant Rachel was no longer considered an autonomous human being in the eyes of the law. She had no legal rights. She could not sign a contract, she could not hire a lawyer, and she could not leave her husband. The state of Washington had officially declared Colin her sole guardian and absolute master. He had the legal right to lock her in a room. He had the legal right to control her medical care. If I walked into a police station right now and slammed my evidence on the desk, the local authorities would run Rachel through the system. The computer would flag her as a severely mentally unstable ward of the state. Colin would simply put on his tailored suit, walk into the precinct, and sadly shake his head. He would tell the officers that his deeply sick wife had wandered off and that her aggressive, delusional father had illegally transported her across county lines. I would be instantly arrested for the federal kidnapping of an incompetent adult. And Rachel would be handed right back to the very monster who chained her to that garage floor. Colin had brilliantly weaponized the justice system to create a perfect, impenetrable shield around his crimes. I leaned my back against the cold hospital wall, feeling a wave of absolute nausea wash over me. But Warren was not finished. He told me there was another piece of data in the court filings. The darkest piece of all. As part of the emergency conservatorship, the judge had granted Colin full, unrestricted, and exclusive custody of my grandson, Leo. My chest tightened so painfully I could barely draw a breath. I had not seen Leo since the day he was born. For 3 entire years, Colin always had a perfect, polished excuse for why I could not visit. It was always cold season, or Leo had a fever, or they were traveling to see Diane. I had spent hours looking at digital photographs, sending expensive toys across the ocean, and desperately waiting for the day my engineering contract would end, so I could finally hold my grandson. Now I understood the terrifying truth. The isolation was a calculated tactic. Colin was slowly cutting Rachel off from the world, ensuring there were no outside observers to witness her gradual destruction. Warren laid out the brutal reality of the situation. If I tipped my hand to the authorities, if I made even a single loud move that alerted Colin to my presence, Colin had the absolute legal power to pack Leo into a car and vanish. He could fly out of the country on a private charter, using his mother's wealth, claiming he was protecting his son from a dangerous family situation. If I tried to save Rachel through the front door of the justice system, I would permanently lose my grandson. I would trigger a legal war that Colin was already positioned to win. Leo was not just a child in this twisted equation. He was Colin's ultimate leverage. He was a hostage held in plain sight. I hung up the phone. The hospital corridor was completely silent. I walked slowly back to the glass window of the trauma bay and looked at my daughter. She was sleeping now, the chemical neutralizer slowly doing its work. I thought about the heavy iron padlock on the garage door. I thought about the massive legal locks Colin had placed on her life. A blinding white-hot fury burned in my chest, but I forced it down. Anger is chaotic, and chaos would get my family killed. I am a structural engineer. I have spent my entire life studying how things are built, how weight is distributed, and most importantly, how to identify the critical stress points of a massive structure. Colin had built an airtight, impregnable legal fortress. But every single fortress has a foundation. Every lie requires a source of funding to maintain. If I could not attack the walls of his lie without risking my grandson, I would have to go underneath. I would have to completely dismantle a corrupt prosecutor's life from the inside out, piece by agonizing piece until his entire world collapsed under its own weight. I pulled my laptop out of my bag, sat down in the plastic hospital chair, and opened a blank terminal screen. It was time to find out exactly where Colin was hiding his money. I left Rachel resting securely under a set of entirely fabricated names at the private trauma clinic. I paid the administrator in cash for the next 48 hours and instructed them that under no circumstances was anyone matching Colin or Diane to be allowed past the front lobby. With my daughter temporarily safe and the chemical neutralizers slowly flushing the military-grade paralytics from her system, I retreated to my heavily dented rental truck, parked out in the rain-swept lot. I locked the doors, turned on the dim overhead cabin light, and pulled my heavy black laptop from my leather travel bag. I opened the screen and let the harsh blue light illuminate the dark interior of the cabin. It was time to stop playing the role of the terrified father and start playing the game I was actually built for. Colin thought he had outsmarted a simple blue-collar construction manager. He thought my years spent in Britain were just about pouring concrete and calculating the load-bearing capacity of steel suspension bridges. That was the cover story I allowed everyone, even Rachel, to believe, because my actual work required absolute discretion. What the arrogant deputy district attorney did not know was that modern structural engineering and global forensic accounting share the exact same fundamental principles. Both disciplines are about tracking hidden weight, identifying invisible stress points, and finding out exactly where a massive structure is bleeding pressure. For the past 3 years in London, I was not just building physical bridges over rivers. I was building highly classified predictive financial algorithms for international banking conglomerates to detect offshore money laundering. I tracked invisible money for a living. And Colin had just invited me into his vault. I connected my laptop to a secure encrypted satellite network I had established during my overseas contracts. My fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, bypassing standard commercial firewalls as if they were made of tissue paper. I targeted the primary servers of the local banking institution, where I knew Rachel held her accounts. Colin was a smart prosecutor, but his digital security was remarkably arrogant. He had set up a complex web of proxy servers to hide his activities, assuming no local law enforcement agency would ever have the technical jurisdiction or the computing power to audit a senior officer of the court. It took my custom algorithms exactly 12 minutes to completely shred his digital defenses and slice through his firewalls. When the encrypted financial portal finally cracked open on my screen, the sheer scale of his betrayal hit me harder than the physical sight of the iron chain in the garage. They had not just isolated and poisoned my daughter. They had been systematically financially liquidating her. Rachel was the sole beneficiary of a massive maternal trust fund established by my late wife. My wife had come from a family of successful real estate developers, and before she passed away from cancer, she liquidated her shares to ensure Rachel would never have to depend on any man for her survival. The trust fund was originally valued at $2.4 million. It was legally designed to be completely untouchable by anyone except Rachel. But Colin had used his emergency medical conservatorship to bypass the ironclad protections of the trust. By having Rachel legally declared mentally incompetent, he had granted himself absolute unrestricted access to her inheritance. I watched the digital ledger scroll down my screen, mapping out a horrifying timeline of pure, unadulterated greed. The theft did not start when he locked her in the garage. It had started 6 full months ago. First, he transferred small, inconspicuous amounts. 10,000 here, 20,000 there. He disguised the withdrawals as specialized medical expenses and private home care renovations. But as the months progressed and Rachel became increasingly isolated, The withdrawals became massive brazen chunks of capital. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were being ripped out of her account every single week. I traced the destination of the stolen capital. Colin was not keeping the money in his own local accounts where it could be monitored. He was funneling every single stolen dollar through a sophisticated shell company registered under a fake corporate board. I ran the tax identification numbers of the shellless company through a global database. The trail led directly back to a high society antique import business owned entirely by his mother. Diane was using her polished upper-class storefront as a giant washing machine for my daughter's stolen inheritance. They were bleeding Rachel dry, turning her mother's life savings into inventory for an antique store and preparing to sell her house right out from under her. They were going to leave her with absolutely nothing trapped in a concrete box until her heart finally gave out from the paralytics. I looked at the bottom of the ledger. The trust fund was almost entirely depleted. There was only one transaction left. A final massive wire transfer of $800,000 was currently sitting in a pending status. It was scheduled to automatically clear and permanently disappear into Diane's offshore corporate accounts at exactly midnight tonight. That was the final piece of their plan. Once that money cleared, the trust would be empty, the house would be sold tomorrow morning, and Rachel would become entirely disposable to them. I checked the clock on my dashboard. It was 11:45. I had 15 minutes before the transfer finalized. My initial instinct was to simply cancel the wire to yank the money back into Rachel's account. But if I did that, the bank would immediately generate an automated cancellation receipt. Colin would receive an email notification on his phone, and he would instantly know someone had breached his security. He would panic, pack his bags, grab my grandson, and disappear into the wind before I could secure the child. I needed to trap the money without alerting the thief. I opened my proprietary coding terminal and wrote a specialized, localized administrative freeze command. I did not cancel the transfer. Instead, I injected a ghost code directly into the receiving account's verification protocol. When midnight struck, the banking system would attempt to deposit the $800,000, but my algorithm would indefinitely suspend the funds in a digital purgatory. On Colin's end, the money would appear to have successfully left Rachel's trust fund, but it would never actually arrive in Diane's account. It would look exactly like a random catastrophic banking error. I executed the command and sat back in the dark cabin, watching the glowing numbers on the clock. Midnight arrived. The system processed the wire. The money vanished from the trust, hit my invisible digital wall, and froze completely in midair. I opened a secondary tracking program to monitor the IP addresses pinging the bank's main server. I did not have to wait long. Exactly 10 minutes later, a rapid succession of frantic, desperate login attempts flooded the server log. It was Colin. He was sitting in his luxury home, refreshing his mother's corporate account over and over again, watching in absolute terror as his final $800,000 payday failed to materialize. The digital footprint was chaotic fast and completely panicked. He was checking the outgoing logs, calling the automated teller lines, and desperately trying to figure out why the grand finale of his flawless crime had suddenly stalled. A slow, cold smile spread across my face in the dark truck. The untouchable prosecutor was finally bleeding. He was sitting in the dark, entirely unaware that the man he thought was a simple construction worker had just hijacked his entire financial existence. But stealing back the money was not enough. I still needed to physically extract my grandson from their compound, and I knew exactly where Diane was going to be spending her stolen money tonight. I knew freezing the stolen trust fund money was only a temporary wound. To truly break them, I had to take back the one thing Colin valued more than his illicit fortune. I had to rescue my grandson, Leo. My intelligence gathering indicated that Diane was hosting her annual philanthropic gala that very evening at the most exclusive country club in the city. She was using the exact capital she had violently ripped from my daughter to buy social influence among the local elite. I drove my battered truck to a high-end menswear boutique downtown and purchased a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. During my overseas contracts, I often attended diplomatic dinners to secure heavy construction permits. I knew exactly how to wear wealth as an invisible shield. Sitting in the parking lot of the boutique, I used my laptop to access the country club network and seamlessly inject my forged digital credentials onto their guest list. I pulled up to the valet stand, an hour later handed over the keys to a newly rented luxury sedan, and walked straight through the heavy oak front doors without a single security guard looking twice at my face. The grand ballroom was a sickening display of stolen opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, brilliant glow over hundreds of politicians, judges, and corporate executives, laughing and drinking expensive champagne. Waiters carried silver trays of caviar, while a string quartet played softly in the corner. And standing right in the center of the room, holding court like a conquering queen, was Diane. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown, but it was the jewelry around her neck that made the blood run entirely cold in my veins. She was wearing my late wife's diamond necklace. It was a custom platinum piece I had commissioned 30 years ago to celebrate Rachel's birth. Diane had not just drained the bank accounts. She had physically raided my daughter's personal safes, looting our most sacred family heirlooms to parade them in front of the city elite. A violent primal urge to walk across that ballroom and tear the necklace directly from her throat flared inside my chest, but I forced my hands to remain perfectly still at my sides. Anger is the enemy of strategy. I was not there for the diamonds. I was there for the bloodline. I grabbed a crystal glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and casually blended into the massive crowd, slowly making my way toward the rear corridors. I knew the architectural layout of these historic country clubs intimately. They always designated the secure upper-floor suites as temporary nurseries for the wealthy guests who brought their children to these lavish events. I slipped past the velvet ropes and walked silently up the carpeted service stairs, avoiding the primary security cameras. The heavy mahogany door at the end of the hallway was secured by a modern biometric keypad and a traditional deadbolt. My engineering background made bypassing commercial security locks almost second nature. I slid a thin titanium tension wrench from my tuxedo pocket, manipulated the internal pins of the deadbolt, and seamlessly bypassed the electronic relay using a handheld descrambler. The heavy door clicked open with a soft metallic whisper. I stepped into the dim, luxurious suite, closing the door silently behind me. The air smelled of expensive baby powder and warm milk. In the center of the room sat a solid mahogany crib, and there, sleeping peacefully under a soft, knitted blanket, was my grandson. My breath caught in my throat. I had not seen him since the day he was born, and looking at his small chest rising and falling, I saw the exact same dark hair and gentle features Rachel had when she was an infant. Every single risk I had taken, every law I had broken tonight, was suddenly entirely worth it. But I could not just walk over and pick him up. Sitting in a leather armchair in the dark corner of the room was a heavily built private security contractor. He wore a tactical earpiece, a tailored black suit, and an empty calculating expression. Colin was not taking any chances with his primary leverage. The guard had his arms crossed and his eyes locked directly on the crib. I calculated the precise distance between the doorway and the armchair. I needed to cross 12 feet of open carpet and incapacitate a highly trained professional without making a single sound that would wake the child or alert the radio network. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket to retrieve a heavy steel flashlight. I took one silent step forward, shifting my weight entirely to the balls of my feet. Then, my secure burner phone vibrated violently against my ribs. I froze instantly. The guard shifted in his chair, turning his head slightly toward the door. I retreated a fraction of an inch back into the deep shadows of the entryway and pulled the phone out. It was a priority emergency alert from the private trauma clinic where I had left my daughter. I pressed the device tightly against my ear, holding my breath. The voice of the hospital administrator was pure, frantic panic. She did not ask for my name. She told me Colin had somehow bypassed their off-the-grid security protocols. He had tracked Rachel's specific location and was currently pulling his official county vehicle directly up to the hospital loading dock. And the corrupt prosecutor was not alone. He had 2 fully armed county sheriff deputies with their weapons drawn, preparing to breach the medical facility and take my daughter back. I held the phone tight against my ear, listening to the terrified hospital administrator describe the armed deputies breaching her lobby. I did not panic. I simply instructed her to step back, comply with all their demands, and point them directly to the trauma bay. I hung up the phone. A cold, calculated calm washed over me. Colin thought he was tracking a helpless victim, but he was completely unaware that I had spent my entire career anticipating structural failures before they ever happened. I knew perfectly well that a senior prosecutor would have backdoor access to municipal emergency tracking software. I knew he would eventually ping the location data embedded in the digital smartwatch Rachel had been wearing when I found her. That is exactly why I had removed the watch from her wrist the moment we arrived at the clinic. Before I even purchased my tuxedo for the gala, I had made a massive cash payment to an underground medical transport courier. These were people I trusted implicitly, former military medics who operated entirely outside the grid. While I was hacking Colin's financial network in the parking lot, an unmarked specialized transport van had arrived at the back loading dock of the clinic. They carefully loaded my daughter into the secure vehicle, administering a continuous drip of the paralytic counteragent. They transported her to a fully equipped, off-the-books safe house I had arranged through my old construction syndicate contacts. She was miles away, surrounded by private security entirely out of Colin's legal jurisdiction. As for the smartwatch, I had securely fastened it to the collar of a stray dog I found wandering near the clinic dumpsters, tossing the animal a piece of beef jerky to keep it occupied near the loading dock. I pictured the scene unfolding at the hospital with deep satisfaction. Colin would be kicking down the door of the trauma bay, with his deputies' weapons drawn, expecting to find his battered wife, terrified and helpless. Instead, he would find nothing but cold, empty sheets and a very confused night shift nurse. He would demand access to the security cameras, only to find my algorithms had already wiped the local hard drives. He would track the GPS signal to the loading dock, rushing out into the rain, with his gun drawn only to find a stray dog eating scraps in the dark. He would realize in that exact moment that he was not hunting a terrified old man. He would realize he was being outplayed on every single level of his own game. But that realization, the shock of his perfect control slipping through his fingers, would keep him occupied for at least 20 minutes. And 20 minutes was all the time I needed to secure his son. I slipped my phone back into my tuxedo pocket and refocused entirely on the heavily guarded nursery suite right in front of me. The private security contractor was still sitting in the leather armchair, staring blankly at the crib. I could not fight him physically. A direct altercation would wake Leo cause the guard to call for backup and trap me on the upper floor of the country club. I needed the guard to leave the room entirely on his own accord. I needed a structural distraction that would override his standing orders to guard the child. Country clubs built in the early 20th century often updated their security systems by patching modern wireless modules into ancient hardwired networks. It was a lazy engineering shortcut that left massive vulnerabilities in the system architecture. During my earlier network intrusion to forge my gala invitation, I had also mapped the digital architecture of the building. I pulled out my secure phone and accessed a hidden terminal application. I typed in a rapid sequence of commands targeting the localized fire suppression system for the VIP wing. I bypassed the central monitoring station to ensure the fire department was not actually dispatched. I did not trigger the main ballroom alarms either, so the party downstairs would continue unabated. I only triggered the specific smoke detectors directly in the hallway outside the nursery, creating an isolated emergency that only this specific guard would have to respond to. I pressed the execute button and held my breath. 3 seconds later, a piercing, high-pitched electronic siren erupted in the corridor. A mechanical voice echoed from the ceiling speakers, instructing all guests in the VIP suites to evacuate immediately. The heavy wooden door of the nursery swung open. The security contractor stepped out into the hallway, his hand resting instinctively on his concealed holster. He looked left and right, scanning the corridor for smoke. He took 3 steps away from the door, pulling his radio to his mouth to contact the main security desk. That was my precise window of opportunity. I moved out of the shadows with complete silent precision. I slipped right behind the distracted guard and glided into the nursery room. The blaring alarm outside was loud, but the thick acoustic paneling of the suite muffled it just enough that Leo was only beginning to stir. I approached the mahogany crib. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but my hands were completely steady. I reached down and scooped the warm, fragile weight of my grandson into my arms. I wrapped the thick, knitted blanket securely around his small body, shielding him from the cold air and pressing his head gently against my shoulder. He let out a soft, sleepy murmur, but did not cry. I did not go back toward the hallway door. The guard would be returning in seconds once he realized there was no fire. I moved swiftly to the large bay window at the rear of the suite. I unlatched the heavy brass lock and slid the glass pane upward. The freezing Seattle rain blew directly into my face. Just outside the window was an old wrought iron fire escape attached to the brick exterior of the building. I climbed out onto the rusted metal platform, holding Leo incredibly tight against my chest, with one arm while gripping the wet iron railing with my free hand. The descent was treacherous. The rusted metal stairs were incredibly slick with accumulated rainwater, and my leather dress shoes offered absolutely no traction on the smooth iron grates. Every single step down required calculated, perfect balance. I moved methodically down the side of the massive brick building. The loud pulsing music and the muffled laughter of the wealthy patrons at the charity gala inside were completely drowned out by the howling wind and the pouring rain whipping across my face. I kept my body angled carefully against the brick wall, using my own frame to protect Leo from the harsh elements. My shoulder burned with the sheer physical effort of holding a heavy toddler with one arm while managing my own body weight on a slippery ladder. I was completely focused on reaching the ground, safely blocking out every other thought in my mind. I reached the final landing. The ground was only 10 feet below me. I carefully lowered the release ladder, letting it slide down until it hit the soft, wet grass of the country club gardens. I climbed down the remaining steps and finally felt the solid earth beneath my boots. A massive wave of relief washed over me. I had him. I had successfully extracted the final piece of Colin's leverage. I turned toward the dark tree line, preparing to disappear into the night and make my way back to my rented sedan. But as I took my very first step into the manicured garden, the entire world exploded in blinding white light. 4 massive industrial halogen floodlights positioned strategically around the perimeter of the lawn snapped on simultaneously. The intense artificial daylight completely blinded me. I froze in place, instinctively turning my body to shield the sleeping child in my arms. The heavy rain looked like silver needles cutting through the brilliant beams of light. I was completely exposed, pinned exactly in the center of the manicured lawn, with absolutely nowhere to run. And then through the blinding glare, I heard the distinct metallic click of a weapon being readied to fire. The brilliant white light from the industrial halogen floodlights was absolutely blinding. I stood completely frozen in the center of the manicured lawn, holding my sleeping grandson tightly against my chest. The heavy Seattle rain fell in freezing sheets, plastering my hair to my forehead and soaking completely through my tailored tuxedo. I turned my body slightly to shield Leo from the harsh weather and the blinding glare. A dark silhouette slowly separated itself from the edge of the tall hedge maze just beyond the perimeter of the light. It was not a private security contractor rushing out to investigate the broken fire escape. It was Diane. She was no longer playing the role of the elegant philanthropic hostess. Her expensive emerald green evening gown was soaked at the hem, dragging heavily through the thick mud of the garden. The custom platinum and diamond necklace that had belonged to my late wife glittered coldly around her neck. But my eyes were entirely focused on her right hand. She was holding a matte black semi-automatic handgun fitted with a long cylindrical suppressor. The metallic click I had heard was the sound of her thumb, casually disengaging the safety mechanism. She stepped into the edge of the light and raised the weapon. Her voice cut clearly through the sound of the falling rain, entirely devoid of her usual polished upper-class accent. She told me to put the boy down on the grass immediately. I looked at the suppressed weapon and then directly into her cold, dead eyes. In that exact moment, the final missing pieces of the puzzle I had been assembling all night locked into their terrifying final configuration. Stealing a trust fund was a sophisticated white-collar crime, but you do not chain your own daughter-in-law to a concrete floor just for money. You do that when you are desperately trying to hide a massive, violent secret. I kept my voice completely steady, projecting it over the sound of the storm. I told her I knew the truth about the shell company. I told her I knew her high society antique business was not just washing my daughter's stolen inheritance. It was a massive financial clearinghouse. It was laundering millions of dollars in illicit cash for a heavily armed regional narcotics syndicate. That was the real secret Rachel had discovered. My daughter was a brilliant financial consultant. She had noticed the subtle discrepancies in the household accounts and traced the shell company back to its violent roots. Diane realized Rachel was a catastrophic threat to a multi-million-dollar cartel operation. The iron chain in the garage was never just about cruelty. It was a temporary holding cell. They needed Rachel incapacitated and discredited with a fake psychiatric hold until they could figure out how to dispose of her permanently without drawing a federal investigation. Diane did not flinch or deny the accusation. She admitted it freely, taking another step closer into the blinding light. She coldly stated that Rachel was always far too smart for her own good, constantly sticking her nose into ledgers where it did not belong. She raised the suppressed barrel of the handgun, pointing it directly at the center of my chest. She warned me that my engineering algorithms and my hacked bank accounts meant absolutely nothing if I was bleeding out on the lawn. She demanded my grandson one last time, promising she would make my death relatively painless if I simply handed him over and walked away. She intended to kill me quietly, bury me on the vast estate grounds, and take the child back upstairs before the charity gala even ended. I did not drop to the wet ground. I did not beg for my life. I adjusted the weight of my grandson in my left arm, shielding his small head against my shoulder. With my right hand, I reached very slowly into the deep interior pocket of my soaked tuxedo jacket. Diane tensed immediately, preparing to pull the trigger, assuming I was drawing a concealed weapon. Instead, I pulled out a thick manila folder, wrapped tightly in clear, waterproof plastic. I tossed it directly at her expensive designer heels. It landed with a heavy, wet thud on the soaked grass right between us. I told her to look closely at the document. I explained that it was the unredacted preliminary autopsy report of Dr. Eris. He was the corrupt medical examiner she and her son had bribed with hundreds of thousands of dollars to sign the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. He was the man who gave them the legal power to lock Rachel in that dark garage. Diane froze in place. Her finger remained tight on the trigger, but she did not fire the weapon. I kept my eyes locked on hers as I explained my countermeasure. When I realized how airtight Colin had built his legal fortress, I knew I could not attack it through the local police force. So I contacted my former intelligence and security associates in London. They did not waste time looking for Colin. They looked for the weakest link in the chain of lies. They tracked the corrupt doctor to a cheap rundown motel off the interstate just 3 hours ago. I told Diane that my associates had a very long and highly persuasive conversation with the doctor in that motel room. He was a coward who took a cartel bribe to buy a luxury yacht, and he broke immediately under pressure. He confessed to absolutely everything. He provided offshore bank routing numbers, hidden communication logs, and the exact dates Diane paid him to falsify Rachel's medical records. Most importantly, he recorded a full high-definition video confession detailing the entire narcotics money laundering operation from top to bottom. I let the heavy silence hang in the freezing air for a fraction of a second before delivering the final devastating blow. I told her the doctor was found dead in his motel room just 2 hours ago, hanging by an electrical cord from the ceiling fixture. It was staged to look like a suicide born of a guilty conscience, but we both knew the narcotics syndicate was aggressively tying up their loose ends. The crucial detail was that my London associates had already heavily encrypted his video confession and emailed it directly to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told her the federal agents received the files exactly 10 minutes before I climbed down that rusted fire escape. The psychological impact of my words hit her harder than a physical strike. Federal tactical teams were already mobilizing across the city. Massive search warrants were being drawn up by federal judges outside of her son's control. Her entire carefully constructed criminal empire was actively collapsing at this exact second. Diane stood completely motionless in the pouring rain. Her sociopathic confidence fractured right in front of my eyes. For the very first time in her privileged life, she realized her stolen money and her local political influence could not buy her way out of the federal trap closing rapidly around her. Her eyes involuntarily darted down toward the thick manila folder resting in the wet grass. She desperately needed to know if I was bluffing. She needed to see the physical proof of her destruction. That tiny involuntary movement of her eyes was the single fatal mistake I had been waiting for all night. It was a biological reflex she could not control. She broke eye contact with me for exactly 1 second, and 1 split second of doubt was all the time I needed to change the entire dynamic of the night. The eyes of Diane flickered down toward the thick manila folder resting in the wet grass for a fraction of a second. That tiny involuntary movement was the only opening I needed. I did not hesitate. I reached beneath my soaked tuxedo jacket and drew the compact 9mm handgun I had kept holstered at the small of my back since I arrived in the city. I did not aim for her chest or her head. I aimed directly at the matte black weapon tightly gripped in her hand. I squeezed the trigger. The loud explosive crack of the gunshot shattered the heavy rhythm of the rainstorm. The bullet struck the steel barrel of her suppressed handgun with absolutely devastating kinetic force. The sheer impact violently twisted her wrist backward, tearing the weapon completely out of her grip and sending it spinning harmlessly into the dark, overgrown branches of the hedge maze. Diane let out a piercing, agonizing scream that echoed across the manicured lawn. She collapsed heavily onto the muddy grass, clutching her shattered wrist against her chest. Her expensive emerald designer gown was instantly ruined, covered in thick mud and her own blood. She looked up at me with her face completely pale and her eyes wide with a mixture of pure physical agony and absolute terror. She fully expected me to walk over and finish the job. She expected me to put a final bullet in her to permanently silence the woman who had brutally tortured my daughter for months. But I simply looked down at her writhing pathetically on the cold ground. Ending her life right then and there was an incredibly easy escape for a monster like her. I wanted her to live long enough to watch every single piece of her stolen wealthy empire burn to ashes around her. I turned my back on her, leaving her bleeding and screaming in the freezing rain. I hurried across the massive dark estate lawn and finally reached my rented luxury sedan, parked discreetly near the valet stand. I opened the heavy rear door and gently placed Leo into the leather back seat, wrapping the thick, knitted blanket securely around his small body. He whimpered slightly at the residual noise ringing in the air, but the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the car roof quickly lulled him back into a deep, peaceful sleep. I slid into the driver's seat, started the powerful engine, and drove swiftly out of the country club gates. I merged onto the deserted interstate highway, heading directly toward the industrial heart of the city. I needed to disappear into the urban sprawl before the local police responded to the noise of the gunshot. By the time the pale morning sun began to slowly rise over the jagged Seattle skyline, the federal trap I had meticulously set was already snapping shut. My attorney Warren called me on my secure encrypted burner phone to deliver the morning intelligence update. The Federal Bureau of Investigation did not waste a single minute after receiving the video confession of the dead doctor from my associates in London. At exactly 6 in the morning, 2 heavily armored tactical vehicles smashed directly through the reinforced front glass windows of the high society antique shop owned by Diane. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents swarmed the luxurious showroom, ripping apart priceless 18th century armoires and slashing open vintage Persian rugs. Hidden inside a sophisticated false wall behind the main executive office, they found exactly what the corrupt doctor had promised. They uncovered massive stacks of illicit cartel cash and the master physical ledgers documenting every single dollar the violent narcotics syndicate had laundered through her legitimate business front. Diane was arrested at the country club while receiving emergency medical attention for her shattered wrist, and she was immediately transferred to a secure federal holding facility. But her son was a completely different kind of monster entirely. Colin was a senior city prosecutor who knew exactly how the complex machinery of the justice system operated. He knew how to effortlessly manipulate the media narrative, and he always had an airtight backup plan. When the explosive news of the federal raid broke across the city, Colin did not rush to the defense of his mother. He did the exact opposite. He immediately contacted his vast network of corrupt local judges and federal contacts to rapidly secure a preemptive immunity deal for himself. He called an emergency press conference on the grand marble steps of the municipal courthouse. He wore a sharp, dark suit and a perfectly fabricated expression of absolute devastation. He stood in front of dozens of local news cameras and publicly threw the woman who gave birth to him directly under the bus. He claimed under oath that he had absolutely no idea about her involvement with the dangerous narcotics cartel. He wiped a highly practiced fake tear from his eye and told the silent reporters that his mother had ruthlessly manipulated his busy schedule as a dedicated public servant to hide her massive criminal enterprise. He painted himself as the tragic, unaware victim of a deeply disturbed family matriarch. He even claimed she was the one who insisted on locking Rachel away, lying to him about the severe medical nature of her mental condition. It was a masterful sociopathic performance designed entirely to save his own prestigious career and protect his stolen hidden fortune. But the corrupt prosecutor did not stop at simply clearing his own name in the press. He knew I had successfully rescued Leo, and he knew I was the invisible architect pulling the strings behind the sudden, catastrophic destruction of the criminal empire of his mother. He decided to weaponize the entire state police force against me to eliminate his final problem. Using his unrevoked administrative authority as a deputy district attorney, he bypassed all standard verification protocols and personally authorized an emergency Amber Alert across the entire state of Washington. He broadcasted my name, my physical description, and the license plate of my original rental truck to every single law enforcement agency in the region. He branded me on national television as a heavily armed and incredibly dangerous fugitive who had violently kidnapped his infant son from a secure location. Suddenly, every digital highway billboard, every local radio station, and every highway patrol computer was actively hunting me. I immediately abandoned the luxury sedan in a crowded long-term airport parking garage and paid an off-duty private driver in cash to take me to the industrial outskirts of the city. I arrived at a rundown cash-only motel hidden deeply within the rusted shipping yards. The off-the-books medical transport team had successfully relocated Rachel to this secondary safe location hours ago. I unlocked the heavy door and walked into the dimly lit motel room carrying my sleeping grandson. Rachel was sitting up in the cheap double bed. She looked incredibly frail, and her skin was pale, but her eyes were finally clear and focused, as the chemical counter-agents completely flushed the military paralytics from her nervous system. When she saw me walk through the door holding her child, she let out a sound that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It was a visceral, broken sob of pure relief. She reached out with heavily bruised, trembling arms. I gently placed Leo onto the mattress, and she pulled him tightly against her chest, burying her face in his dark hair and weeping uncontrollably. I walked over to the dirty window and stood near the drawn curtains, watching the flashing red and blue lights of a state police cruiser slowly pass by the cracked asphalt of the motel parking lot. I had successfully rescued my family from the dark concrete garage, but we were now trapped in a much larger, more dangerous prison. We were officially the most wanted fugitives in the entire state, sitting in a cheap motel room, while the true architect of this nightmare continued to walk completely free. Sitting in that damp, cheap motel room with the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers passing by the cracked window, I knew I was completely outgunned. I could not engage in a direct physical war with the entire state police force. They possessed helicopters, tactical SWAT teams, and the absolute unyielding authority of the law on their side. Colin had brilliantly painted a massive target on my back by utilizing the emergency broadcast system. He branded me a highly dangerous armed fugitive who had violently kidnapped a child. If an ambitious state trooper spotted my face, I would be thrown directly into a federal holding cell before I could even utter a single syllable in my defense. Rachel would be left completely unprotected once again, and my infant grandson would be thrust right back into the very corrupt system I had just rescued him from. I needed to fundamentally change the rules of this engagement. I could not physically fight the state of Washington, but I could force this man pulling the strings to call off the manhunt himself. To achieve that, I had to attack the only thing Colin worshipped more than his own carefully crafted public image. I had to attack his hidden empire of stolen wealth. Colin was currently sitting securely in his luxury downtown office, completely surrounded by armed police escorts and basking in the warm glow of his own fabricated victimhood. He genuinely believed he was completely untouchable behind the badge of the district attorney. But my years of building complex forensic accounting algorithms for international banking conglomerates taught me one universal truth about incredibly corrupt men. They never truly trust the traditional banking system. When you are laundering millions of dollars for a violent regional narcotics syndicate, you do not leave your personal fortune sitting in a standard commercial checking account. You convert it into untraceable digital assets. You hide your true wealth in the dark, encrypted corners of the internet. I opened my heavy black laptop and rested it gently on the cheap laminate table of the dimly lit motel room. Rachel was finally sleeping deeply on the double bed, holding little Leo safely against her chest. The room was completely silent except for the rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. I did not target the regional banking institutions this time. I aimed my custom algorithms directly at the municipal servers of the city courthouse. Colin felt completely safe within the fortified digital walls of the prosecutor network. But government networks are almost always built by the lowest bidder contractors. They are structurally flawed and incredibly vulnerable if you know exactly where to apply the pressure. I deployed a silent infiltration protocol, slipping effortlessly through a forgotten maintenance backdoor in the courthouse server architecture. It took my programs less than 20 minutes to gain absolute administrative control over the entire internal communications network of the city. I navigated my phantom connection directly into the personal, secure desktop computer sitting on the desk of Colin. I seamlessly bypassed his expensive commercial firewalls and silently activated the tiny integrated webcam resting at the top of his large office monitor. A grainy, high-definition image immediately flickered onto my laptop screen. Colin was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, sipping a glass of amber liquid, and casually scrolling through the local news articles praising his bravery during this tragic family crisis. He looked incredibly relaxed for a man whose wife was supposedly missing and deeply ill. He was completely oblivious to the fact that an invisible digital ghost was currently occupying his private sanctuary. I dug deep into the hidden partitioned hard drives of his machine. It took several complex decryption sequences, but I finally found exactly what I was hunting for. Colin had amassed a staggering offshore cryptocurrency portfolio. It was a massive digital vault holding the pure, concentrated profit of his entire criminal career. Millions of dollars were sitting quietly, in the dark, completely hidden from the Internal Revenue Service and his dangerous cartel associates. This was his ultimate escape fund. This was the massive fortune he planned to use when he finally disposed of my daughter and vanished into a life of absolute luxury. I did not simply attempt to steal the digital currency all at once. A sudden massive transfer would immediately trigger automated security fail-safes and lock the entire account down permanently. Instead, I designed a custom predatory algorithm. It was a vicious digital parasite designed to silently latch onto his encrypted wallets and slowly bleed them dry. I programmed the code to entirely bypass the standard transaction limits and begin siphoning the digital coins out of his possession penny by agonizing penny, transferring the funds directly into a decentralized digital void where they could never be traced or recovered. Once the parasitic algorithm was securely attached and fully primed, I prepared my message. I hijacked the primary display drivers of his office computer. I forced his expensive dual monitors to instantly go completely black. The sudden, unexpected darkness made Colin jump in his leather executive chair. I watched closely through the hacked webcam as he frantically clicked his wireless mouse and slammed his fingers aggressively against the keyboard, trying desperately to wake the frozen screens. He clearly assumed it was just a simple power failure or a minor technical glitch. Then I initiated the broadcast. A live streaming video feed slowly materialized on his black screens. It was not a pre-recorded message. It was a direct, real-time view of his secret offshore cryptocurrency wallets. Right beneath the massive total balance of his illicit fortune, a bright red progress bar appeared on the screen. The numbers began to rapidly tick downward. $100 vanished. $500 disappeared. $1,000 evaporated. The algorithm was actively eating his entire life savings right in front of his eyes. I watched the arrogant color completely drain from his face. The smug, relaxed expression vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He lunged forward, gripping the polished edges of his desk so hard his knuckles turned entirely white. A simple line of stark white text slowly typed itself across the bottom of his monitor. It informed him that the extraction algorithm was permanent and could not be stopped by rebooting the system or unplugging the internet connection. It clearly stated that his entire secret fortune would be reduced to absolute zero in exactly 90 minutes. There was only one possible way to halt the irreversible process. I instructed him that the algorithm required a very specific physical biometric override to terminate. I had set up a heavily encrypted physical terminal at an abandoned rusted shipyard located on the desolate outer edge of the city harbor. I provided the exact geographical coordinates on the screen. The final line of text laid out the ultimatum with brutal, undeniable clarity. He had to arrive at the abandoned shipyard entirely alone. If he brought his armed police escort, if he triggered a single radio transmission, or if he attempted to send a tactical SWAT team to the location, the algorithm would instantly accelerate and incinerate his entire portfolio in seconds. He was now firmly trapped in a terrifying psychological vice of his own making. He had spent the entire morning building a perfect, impenetrable shield of state police protection around himself. But remaining safely behind that heavy shield meant sitting in his chair and watching his massive secret fortune burn to ashes. I watched his internal panic escalate through the hidden camera. He looked frantically toward the heavy oak office door, where two heavily armed state troopers were currently standing guard to protect the tragic husband. He looked back at the glowing screen where another $10,000 silently evaporated into the digital void. The overwhelming greed inside him was a terminal disease. It completely clouded his sharp legal mind and entirely overrode his basic survival instincts. He simply could not walk away from millions of dollars. I watched as he reached slowly into his bottom desk drawer and pulled out a small, snub-nosed revolver, checking the loaded cylinder with trembling hands. He shoved the concealed weapon into the waistband of his tailored trousers and stood up from his desk. He was going to sneak out of his own heavily guarded office building. He was actively choosing to abandon his perfect public alibi and walk directly into the dark, industrial unknown. I closed the laptop screen and quietly stood up from the motel table. The digital bait was successfully taken. The corrupt hunter was successfully lured out of his impenetrable fortress. It was time for me to leave the safety of the motel room and prepare the final stage at the rotting shipyard. The abandoned commercial shipyard was a desolate graveyard of rusted iron and forgotten industry located on the absolute furthest edge of the city harbor. The freezing coastal rain drummed a heavy, relentless rhythm against the hollow steel hulls of decaying cargo vessels docked in the black water. The harsh wind howled through the towering mechanical shipping cranes, creating a terrible sound that resembled grinding metal teeth in the dark. I stood completely still beneath the massive shadow of a broken gantry crane, allowing the freezing rain to wash over my face. In front of me sat an overturned heavy industrial oil barrel. Resting flat on top of the rusted circular metal surface was my black laptop. The screen cast a pale, harsh blue light into the damp, swirling fog. I waited in the absolute silence of the isolation. I knew with absolute certainty that he was coming. A man possessed by that extreme level of pure financial greed could never simply walk away from his secret, illicit fortune. He would willingly risk his pristine career, his personal freedom, and his own life to save his millions. 30 agonizing minutes passed before a pair of dim halogen headlights finally cut through the thick coastal fog. An unmarked dark gray sedan slowly crept into the abandoned loading zone. The heavy tires crunched loudly over broken glass, discarded shell casings, and rusted bolts scattered across the cracked asphalt. The vehicle came to a sudden, abrupt halt exactly 40 yards from where I stood waiting in the shadows. The engine was violently cut off, and the headlights went completely dark, plunging the yard back into shadows. The driver's side door opened with a sharp metallic creak that echoed across the empty docks. Colin stepped out into the freezing, violent storm. He was completely alone. He had voluntarily abandoned his massive state police escort and sneaked out of his secure legal fortress exactly as I knew he would. He wore a dark waterproof trench coat pulled tightly over his expensive tailored suit, but the polished, arrogant, confident aura of the untouchable deputy district attorney was completely eradicated. He looked frantic, desperate, and incredibly dangerous. He walked slowly toward the pale blue light of the laptop screen, his boots splashing heavily in the deep, oily puddles. In his right hand he held a small, silver, snub-nosed revolver. The barrel of the weapon was pointed directly and steadily at the center of my chest. The corrupt hunter had finally arrived to reclaim his stolen prize. He stopped exactly 10 paces away, keeping a cautious, tactical distance between us. The freezing rain plastered his perfectly styled hair flat to his forehead, and his eyes darted nervously around the dark, towering structures of the shipyard, actively searching for a hidden ambush or a tactical police trap. His voice trembled with a volatile mixture of pure adrenaline rage and deep underlying fear. He aggressively demanded that I immediately type the override command and stop the financial extraction algorithm bleeding his accounts. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his soaked coat, as he desperately tried to regain control of the narrative. He offered a calculated trade. He promised to officially drop the emergency Amber Alert and immediately call off the massive state police manhunt if I simply pressed a button on that keyboard and gave him back his offshore cryptocurrency wallets. He swore he would let me take Rachel and the boy out of the state without any legal interference. He was attempting to negotiate exactly like a cornered rat, bargaining for a way out of a trap he built himself. He took another deliberate step forward, tightening his white-knuckled grip on the small silver weapon. He tried to forcefully reclaim his imposing courtroom authority, projecting his voice over the storm. He arrogantly stated that I possessed absolutely no physical, tangible proof that he was the one who locked my daughter in that horrific concrete garage. He claimed I was just a delusional old man running on pure emotional hysteria. He told me that no jury in the entire state of Washington would ever believe the wild accusations of a disgruntled grandfather over the sworn word of a highly decorated senior prosecutor. He reminded me that he controlled the judges, he controlled the local police, and he controlled the entire legal narrative of the city. He firmly believed his legal shield was still entirely intact. I did not flinch at his threats. I did not raise my hands in surrender to the weapon pointed at my heart. I did not even look down at the glowing laptop screen resting on the steel barrel between us. Instead, I slowly tilted my head back and looked high up into the freezing rain, staring directly toward the massive rusted gears of the towering shipping crane looming directly above our heads. I kept my voice incredibly calm, entirely cold, and completely level, projecting it clearly over the loud sound of the howling wind and the crashing waves. I told him he was absolutely right about the jury. I told him I did not need physical proof for a courtroom trial because we were never going to see the inside of a courtroom. I explained that his intricate web of legal lies and his perfect public facade were entirely useless out here in the dark. I finally lowered my gaze and looked down at the glowing laptop. The screen was not actually displaying a complex hacking terminal. It was not displaying a cryptocurrency extraction progress bar at all. It was displaying a very simple audio equalizer interface with a bright red recording indicator flashing steadily in the top corner. I looked back into his terrified eyes and explained the reality of his situation. I told him that the predatory algorithm currently draining his monies was entirely automated and could never be stopped by any physical password. The ultimatum I sent to his office was nothing but a calculated digital lure. I told him this specific computer was doing something else entirely. It was serving as a highly encrypted broadband transmitter. Everything he had just said to me, every single threat, every admission of framing me, and every desperate negotiation to trade his son for his illicit fortune had been captured perfectly by the high-definition microphone built into the machine. I reached out with a steady, deliberate hand and firmly tapped the heavy plastic spacebar on the keyboard. I tapped the heavy plastic spacebar on the keyboard. The fake audio equalizer interface instantly vanished from the bright, glowing screen. It was immediately replaced by a stark black command terminal displaying 3 active digital connection nodes. I looked directly at Colin and spoke with absolute crystal clarity over the howling coastal wind. I told him he was currently broadcasting live on the Emergency Ethics Channel of the Washington State Bar Association. I told him the second connection was a direct encrypted uplink to the Regional Field Office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And the third connection was directly patched into the personal mobile phone of the district attorney himself. The absolute silence that followed my words was heavier and colder than the freezing rain pounding against the concrete docks. I wanted him to fully understand the catastrophic magnitude of what he had just done. I explained that for the past 10 minutes, every single arrogant word he spoke had been transmitted with perfect high-definition clarity to the very people who gave him his legal power. They heard him explicitly admit to faking the medical conservatorship. They heard him confess to locking my daughter in that horrific freezing garage. They heard him acknowledge the multi-million-dollar narcotics laundering operation run by his mother. And most damning of all, they heard a sworn officer of the court actively attempt to extort a hostage exchange offering to drop a fabricated statewide Amber Alert in return for access to an illegal offshore cryptocurrency fortune. He had just handed the federal government a perfect, unassailable verbal confession wrapped in a neat digital bow. I watched the terrifying reality of the situation physically crush him right in front of my eyes. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty chalk. His mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no sound came out. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life controlling the narrative, manipulating the truth, and using the justice system as his own personal weapon. Now that exact same system was actively closing around his throat. He looked frantically at the glowing screen of the laptop and then out into the absolute darkness of the abandoned shipyard. He finally understood that the emergency Amber Alert he issued to hunt me down was completely worthless. He was no longer the untouchable deputy district attorney of Seattle. He was a disgraced criminal caught on tape extorting a grandfather in a deserted harbor. I did not pull this operation off entirely by myself, while I was hacking the municipal servers from that cheap motel room. My corporate attorney Warren was aggressively working the federal angle. Warren is a legal bulldog who understands how to weaponize jurisdiction. The exact moment I successfully planted the cryptocurrency bait on the computer of Colin Warren, contacted his highest-level contacts within the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He provided them with the precise geographical coordinates of the abandoned shipyard and explained the digital trap. The federal agents did not hesitate for a single second. While Colin was sneaking out of his heavily guarded office building, a highly specialized tactical hostage rescue team was already quietly moving into position around the perimeter of the dark docks. I kept Colin talking just long enough for the federal snipers to find their high ground perches in the rusted gantry cranes directly above us. Colin looked back at me, and the sheer panic in his eyes rapidly mutated into something far more dangerous. It morphed into a dark, pure, sociopathic rage. He realized his immaculate, prestigious career was permanently dead. He realized his hidden millions were gone forever. He knew he was going to spend the rest of his natural life rotting in a maximum security federal prison. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. His chest heaved violently as he tightened his grip on the small silver revolver. He bared his teeth like a cornered, desperate animal. He decided that if his perfect world was burning to ashes tonight, he was going to make absolutely certain that I did not live to see the sunrise. He raised his right arm, leveling the barrel of the weapon directly at my face. I could see his finger tightening around the trigger mechanism. I did not dive for the ground. I did not try to draw my own concealed weapon. I simply stood my ground beside the steel barrel and stared directly into his eyes, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me afraid. I knew I was not standing alone in the dark. Before the hammer of his revolver could strike the firing pin, a massive, deafening crack echoed from the top of the towering shipping crane above us. It was not the sound of a standard handgun. It was the devastating supersonic boom of a high-caliber sniper rifle. The impact was instantaneous and incredibly violent. A specialized tactical round smashed directly into the right shoulder of Colin with the raw kinetic force of a speeding freight train. The heavy bullet completely shattered his collarbone and neutralized his entire arm in a fraction of a second. The sheer momentum of the heavy sniper round spun his body violently in a circle. The silver revolver flew entirely out of his paralyzed hand, splashing harmlessly into the dark, freezing water of the harbor. Colin let out a blood-curdling shriek of pure, absolute agony. His knees buckled instantly, and he collapsed hard onto the wet, oil-stained concrete of the shipyard. He rolled onto his side, clutching his severely ruined shoulder, as dark blood rapidly mixed with the freezing rain pouring down around him. His cries of intense pain echoed pathetically against the rusted metal hulls of the massive cargo ships. The trap was completely sprung. The exact second Colin hit the ground, the entire abandoned shipyard was suddenly bathed in blinding, chaotic light. 6 massive, armored federal tactical vehicles roared out from behind the decaying warehouses, with their heavy tires screeching aggressively against the wet asphalt. Intense blue and red emergency strobes pierced through the thick coastal fog, illuminating the docks like an active war zone. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents wearing black tactical gear poured out of the vehicles, shouting absolute commands over the loud sound of the storm. They moved with terrifying military precision, completely surrounding the bleeding, corrupt prosecutor, with assault rifles raised and red laser sights painted directly on his chest. I stood completely still, stepping back from the rusted steel barrel as the agents swarmed the area. A senior tactical team leader approached the laptop, verifying the active audio transmission, before shutting the heavy lid. 2 agents roughly grabbed Colin by his uninjured arm, dragging him up from the freezing puddle and slamming his face hard against the steel hood of an armored truck. They did not treat him like a respected colleague of the court. They treated him exactly like the violent cartel associate he truly was. They ratcheted heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, completely ignoring his agonizing screams about his shattered shoulder. I watched the federal agents strip away the last remaining pieces of his arrogant dignity. The man who had chained my brilliant daughter to a cold garage floor was now bound in heavy iron himself, bleeding and crying in the mud. The false amber alert he issued was already being officially canceled across the entire state network. My name was completely cleared before the morning sun even had a chance to rise over the Seattle skyline. I turned my back on the pathetic scene and walked slowly toward the perimeter of the federal blockade. The violent war was officially over. I needed to get back to that cheap motel room. I needed to hold my infant grandson and tell my daughter that the absolute monsters who tortured her were finally locked inside a cage they could never escape. The morning sun broke through the heavy Seattle clouds, casting a cold, bright light over the city. It was the first time in 3 years that I felt the tight, suffocating grip of anxiety begin to loosen in my chest. The physical violence was over. Colin was currently lying in a secure medical ward at the Federal Detention Center. His shattered shoulder was bolted together with surgical steel, and his right wrist was handcuffed permanently to the iron bed frame. He was stripped of his tailored suits, his expensive watches, and his untouchable title. His mother, Diane, was locked in a subterranean holding cell, facing a mountain of federal indictments. The Bureau of Investigation did not just charge her with financial fraud. Because she was moving millions of dollars for a violent armed cartel, the federal prosecutors hit her with domestic terrorism and international drug trafficking charges. She was going to spend the rest of her natural life breathing recycled prison air. But putting the monsters in cages did not automatically fix the massive structural damage they had done to my family. Rachel was currently resting in a secure safe house holding my grandson Leo and slowly regaining her physical strength. But legally, she was still trapped. In the eyes of the state of Washington, she was still considered a deeply unstable, incompetent ward of the state. I could not let that completely fabricated lie stand for another 24 hours. The physical war was won at the shipyard, but the legal war was just beginning. It was time to completely tear down the fraudulent legal foundation Colin had built. I did not go to the courthouse myself. I sent Warren. My corporate attorney did not fly in from Chicago to politely ask for favors or file standard appeals. Warren operates like a heavy demolition crew. He walked through the towering brass doors of the municipal civil courthouse that morning, carrying a leather briefcase packed with absolute legal destruction. He bypassed the standard clerks and marched directly into the private administrative chambers of the presiding Superior Court judge. This was the exact same judge who had casually signed away the basic human rights of my daughter 4 days earlier, simply because a corrupt deputy district attorney asked him to. Warren did not sit down when he entered the polished mahogany office. He stood over the large desk and dropped a massive stack of federal affidavits directly onto the center of the leather blotter. He informed the judge that the man who requested the emergency medical conservatorship was currently in federal custody for extortion, kidnapping, and money laundering. He explained in brutal, agonizing detail exactly what Colin and Diane had done to my daughter, while the court completely turned a blind eye. The judge attempted to defend himself. He stammered and claimed he was simply following standard legal protocols based on the sworn professional testimony of a senior prosecutor. He tried to hide behind the immense bureaucratic shield of the justice system. But Warren was not there to listen to bureaucratic excuses. He was there to deliver an ultimatum. Warren pulled a second document from his briefcase and slid it across the desk. It was a fully drafted, devastating civil forfeiture and gross negligence lawsuit. We were not just suing Colin. We were actively suing the entire city municipality, the district attorney office, and the civil court system itself. Warren explained that by allowing a corrupt prosecutor to weaponize their legal authority without a single independent medical verification, the city had actively facilitated the torture of an innocent mother. He promised the judge that if the conservatorship was not instantly dissolved, he would leak the entire lawsuit to every major national news network in the country. He promised a media circus so massive and so incredibly humiliating that every single elected official in the building would lose their jobs by the end of the week. The strategy was flawless. Bureaucrats and politicians care about one thing above all else. They care about their own public survival. The judge stared at the lawsuit, and the color completely drained from his face. He was absolutely terrified of the impending public fallout. He realized his own signature was at the bottom of the document that allowed my daughter to be chained to a concrete floor. The sheer liability was astronomical. The judge reached for his heavy gold fountain pen with a trembling hand. He did not call for a hearing. He did not ask for a waiting period. He immediately drafted an emergency reversal order. He legally struck down the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, declaring it entirely invalid and corrupt. With a single stroke of his pen, he completely dissolved the medical conservatorship. Rachel was instantly restored to her full legal status as a competent, autonomous human being. But Warren did not stop there. He pointed out that Colin had used the exact same fraudulent evaluation to secure full custody of Leo. Since the foundational document was now legally void, the custody order was entirely poisoned fruit. The terrified judge nodded quickly, entirely eager to make the nightmare go away. He drafted a second emergency order. He permanently stripped Colin of all parental rights, citing his violent federal crimes and the extreme danger he posed to the child. The judge granted Rachel sole, permanent, and unchallengeable custody of her son. Warren walked out of the courthouse an hour later, holding 2 legally binding court orders stamped with the official seal of the state. When he brought those papers back to the safe house and placed them gently into the trembling hands of my daughter, the emotional release was absolutely overwhelming. Rachel read the words on the thick paper and broke down into heavy weeping. She pulled Leo tightly against her chest, knowing with absolute legal certainty that no one could ever take her baby away from her again. She was finally free. The heavy, invisible chains were permanently broken, but the bitter reality of our victory quickly began to settle over the room. Freedom is a beautiful concept, but it does not pay for groceries. It does not pay for medical bills or diapers or a safe place to sleep. While Warren had successfully performed a miracle in the civil court, the federal court system was an entirely different and infinitely slower machine. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided the antique shop and arrested Diane, they triggered a massive organized crime protocol. Because Diane had deliberately funneled the stolen millions from the trust fund of my daughter through her cartel shell company, the government classified every single dollar as illicit drug money. The federal agents seized the bank accounts, they seized the antique business, and they seized the massive suburban estate where Rachel used to live. They froze every single financial asset connected to the family. Warren carefully explained the devastating financial reality to us. He told Rachel that her $2.4 million inheritance was currently locked inside a secure federal evidence ledger. The government needed to hold the money while they built their massive racketeering case against the regional narcotics syndicate. The legal process of untangling her stolen trust fund from the cartel drug money would take a minimum of 3 to 5 years of aggressive federal litigation. Even the residential house was locked down as an active crime scene and could not be sold or lived in. And the offshore cryptocurrency fortune that I had drained from the secret accounts of Colin was gone forever. I had deliberately sent those digital coins into a decentralized void to force his hand at the shipyard. I could never retrieve that money without proving I had committed massive federal cybercrimes to get it. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her legal papers in one hand and her sleeping son in the other. She looked up at me with tired, hollow eyes. She was officially a free woman. She was the sole guardian of her beautiful boy. She had survived a nightmare that would have broken almost anyone else. But as the afternoon sun faded outside the window, the terrifying truth remained. The corrupt prosecutor and his sociopathic mother had successfully destroyed her entire financial existence before they fell. She was completely, entirely, and legally bankrupt. We had won the war, but we were standing in the smoking ruins of her life with absolutely nothing left but each other. I sat across from Warren at the small kitchen table of the safe house, watching Rachel sleep in the other room. The federal government had locked her entire inheritance inside an evidence vault and told us to wait for years while they built their criminal case. But I am not a man who waits for bureaucrats to dictate the survival of my family. I did not cross an ocean and break my daughter out of a concrete cell just to watch her file for bankruptcy and struggle to feed my grandson. I told Warren we were not going on the defensive anymore. If Colin and Diane had built their fraudulent empire using my daughter as a shield, then we were going to take the entire castle. Warren opened his thick leather briefcase and poured hundreds of pages of financial records across the table. We spent the entire night drinking black coffee and hunting for a structural flaw in their corporate architecture. The regional narcotics syndicate did not just keep their illicit money in offshore cryptocurrency wallets or antique store safes. A criminal enterprise of that massive scale needs to eventually wash its cash through clean, legitimate assets. We discovered that Diane had used her extensive high society connections to establish a premium luxury real estate firm. This firm operated entirely above board on paper, purchasing incredibly valuable commercial and residential properties right in the heart of the city. But to acquire the initial massive bank loans required to buy these properties, the syndicate needed a pristine financial applicant. They needed someone with an absolutely perfect credit history and zero criminal connections. Colin being the arrogant prosecutor that he was, decided to cut corners. Instead of finding a legitimate wealthy investor, he simply forged the signature of my daughter. He used the immaculate financial record of Rachel to secure the absolute lowest premium interest rates from the federal banks. It was a completely arrogant and fatal mistake. Colin assumed Rachel would remain locked in that garage until she simply ceased to exist, and no one would ever audit the original loan origination documents. But by fraudulently using her name on the primary incorporation paperwork, he accidentally created a catastrophic legal loophole. Warren looked up from the documents right as the morning sun began to illuminate the safe house. He took off his reading glasses and smiled a very dangerous smile. He explained that because the federal government had already legally voided the conservatorship, Rachel was fully restored as a competent adult. And according to the very documents Colin had filed with the state, Rachel was not just an unwitting victim. Legally speaking, my daughter was the primary majority shareholder of the entire luxury real estate syndicate. The cartel had deliberately placed their absolute cleanest and most valuable assets directly into her name to avoid federal suspicion. They thought they had buried her, but they had actually crowned her. I did not wait for the federal agents to figure this out and freeze these assets too. I told Warren we had exactly 48 hours before the cartel lawyers realized what was happening and attempted to block us in civil court. We left the safe house immediately and drove straight into the towering financial district of the city. We walked directly into the sleek glass and steel corporate headquarters of the luxury real estate firm. The receptionist tried to stop us, but Warren bypassed her entirely, marching straight into the massive executive boardroom where the civilian associates of Diane were currently holding a panicked emergency meeting. These were the polished men and women who quietly managed the clean properties for the syndicate, pretending they did not know where the initial funding came from. They looked up in absolute shock as a towering construction engineer and a vicious corporate attorney locked the boardroom doors behind them. Warren did not negotiate. He slammed the certified state documents onto the center of the glass table. He announced that he was legally representing the primary majority shareholder of the firm, and he was executing an immediate hostile corporate takeover. He informed the terrified board members that they were all officially terminated, effective immediately. One of the senior vice presidents stood up and threatened to call the police. Warren handed him my cell phone and offered to dial the Federal Bureau of Investigation for him so they could discuss his intimate financial relationship with a known narcotics trafficker. The vice president sat back down, completely silent. Within exactly 2 hours, we had completely seized total operational control of the entire firm. But we did not want to run a company tainted by cartel history. We wanted to extract the clean physical assets and completely sever the corporate entity. I used my background in commercial development to aggressively audit their property portfolio on the spot. I identified the 3 most lucrative residential properties in their possession. These were towering state-of-the-art luxury apartment buildings located in the most expensive metropolitan districts of the city, completely filled with high-paying legitimate tenants. I also identified a massive premium commercial plaza housing, several highly profitable retail stores, and upscale restaurants. These 4 specific properties represented tens of millions of dollars in entirely clean, legitimate equity. Warren drafted the aggressive transfer deeds right there in the hijacked boardroom. We did not sell the properties for cash, because a massive sudden cash liquidation would trigger immediate federal banking freezes. Instead, we executed a complex structural maneuver. Warren legally transferred the physical titles of the 3 luxury apartment buildings and the commercial plaza entirely out of the syndicate corporate holdings and placed them directly into a brand new ironclad private trust. This was not a vulnerable trust like the one Colin had stolen. This was a completely impenetrable fortress designed by Warren and myself. We named my infant grandson Leo as the sole ultimate beneficiary and established Rachel as the permanent executive trustee with absolute unilateral control over the assets. We moved with absolute ruthless efficiency, pulling every single legal lever available to us. By the end of the second day, the ink was officially dry and the state property seals were permanently stamped. The cartel lost their most valuable physical investments in the blink of an eye, entirely unable to challenge the transfers without admitting their own massive federal crimes in an open courtroom. The shell company was completely gutted, leaving nothing behind but empty bank accounts and useless paperwork for the federal agents to eventually seize. I drove back to the quiet safe house as the sun began to set over the city, casting a warm golden light across the streets. I walked into the bedroom where Rachel was gently rocking Leo to sleep in a small wooden rocking chair. I did not hand her a stack of complicated legal briefs or try to explain the complex corporate structure we had just dismantled. I simply reached into my pocket and handed her a heavy brass key ring holding the master access keys to 3 luxury high-rises and a commercial plaza. I sat down next to her and watched the profound confusion on her face slowly transform into absolute awe as I explained what we had just done over the last 48 hours. She was no longer a bankrupt victim hiding in the shadows waiting for the government to hand back her stolen life. We had successfully taken the very bricks and mortar her enemies used to build their massive criminal empire, and we used them to pave a permanent golden road for her and my grandson. She looked down at the brass keys shining in her hand, and then she looked up at me with tears of pure gratitude streaming down her face. The financial destruction Colin and Diane intended for her was completely reversed. Rachel was now one of the wealthiest property owners in the entire city, and there was absolutely nothing her abusers could do to stop it. 6 months had passed since the violent storm at the abandoned shipyard and the hostile takeover of the corporate syndicate. I drove my heavy truck through the barren flatlands of the eastern desert, approaching the towering concrete walls and razor wire fences of the federal maximum security correctional facility. The sheer contrast between the lush green manicured lawns of the country club where I last saw her and this desolate sun-baked wasteland was absolute. I walked through 3 separate heavily fortified security checkpoints, emptying my pockets and submitting to the cold mechanical searches. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead, and the sharp chemical smell of industrial bleach and unwashed bodies hung thick in the stagnant air. Heavy steel doors slammed shut behind me with a sickening metallic finality. I was escorted by 2 armed correctional officers into the bleak visitor center, taking my seat in a cold metal chair bolted firmly to the concrete floor. A thick pane of smudged bulletproof glass separated me from the empty chair on the other side. A heavy iron door opened on the inmate side of the glass. 2 guards escorted Diane into the small, sterile cubicle. The physical transformation she had undergone in just 6 short months was nothing short of staggering. The wealthy, arrogant matriarch who used to wear custom emerald gowns and parade around in my late wife's diamonds was completely gone. She was entirely swallowed up by a baggy standard-issue orange canvas jumpsuit. Her perfectly dyed and styled hair was now entirely gray limp and pulled back into a severe, harsh knot. The expensive cosmetic treatments she used to maintain her youth had completely faded, revealing deep, hollow lines of chronic stress and absolute defeat carved deeply into her pale face. She looked like she had aged an entire decade in half a year. She sat down heavily in the metal chair, pressing her handcuffed wrists against the narrow stainless steel counter. She looked at me through the thick, reinforced glass. She tried desperately to summon that old, familiar upper-class sneer. She tried to look down on me, just like she did when she held a suppressed weapon in the freezing rain. She asked me if I took time out of my pathetic blue-collar life just to travel all the way across the state to gloat. She tried to sound incredibly tough, but her voice completely betrayed her. It was thin, trembling, and entirely devoid of power. I looked at her with absolutely no pity in my heart. I kept my voice incredibly calm and perfectly level, projecting it clearly through the small metal speaker grill cut into the center of the glass. I told her I did not come to gloat. Gloating is for weak people who are surprised by their own victory. I told her I came simply to deliver a final message and to update her on the current status of her bloodline. I told her about Colin. I explained that her brilliant, untouchable prosecutor's son was currently sitting in a different federal maximum security facility 300 miles away. He tried to negotiate a cowardly plea deal, but the federal prosecutors used the crystal-clear audio recording I captured at the shipyard to completely bury him in court. He was officially sentenced to 40 consecutive years in federal prison without the slightest possibility of early parole. I told her that his right shoulder never properly healed from the devastating impact of the federal sniper bullet, leaving his arm permanently paralyzed and hanging uselessly at his side. He spends 23 hours a day locked in solitary confinement because the general prison population absolutely despises corrupt cops and dirty prosecutors. I watched her faded eyes twitch as the horrifying reality of her only son dying slowly in a concrete box washed over her. But the miserable fate of Colin was not the primary message I came to deliver. I reached slowly into the inner breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out a single high-resolution glossy photograph. I did not just hold it up for a fleeting second. I pressed the image completely flat against the reinforced glass, so she was forced to study every single devastating detail. I told her to look very closely at the picture. The photograph showed Rachel. My brilliant daughter looked absolutely radiant. The terrible hollow bruises and the severe emaciation from the military paralytics were completely gone. She was wearing a beautiful flowing summer dress, and her hair was blowing freely in the warm wind. She was holding my grandson Leo, who was laughing brightly and pointing at something off camera. They looked like the absolute picture of perfect health and immense generational wealth. Diane stared directly at the photograph, and her breathing began to grow incredibly heavy and erratic. She recognized the specific location where the picture was taken instantly. I explained the architectural details aloud, just in case her memory was failing in her old age. I told her the photo was taken on the massive wraparound master balcony of a stunning multi-million-dollar suburban estate. I told her it was her estate. When the federal government seized all of her cartel-tainted properties, they eventually auctioned them off to the public to recoup the dirty money. I explained that Rachel, acting as the primary executive trustee of her newly acquired clean corporate empire, used her massive legitimate capital to purchase the estate directly from the federal government at a tiny fraction of its actual market value. We did not just buy the house, I told her. We completely erased her entire miserable legacy from the property. I described how I personally hired a heavy industrial demolition crew to tear down the thick walls of the dark, windowless garage where she had chained my daughter to the floor. We completely leveled that chamber of horrors, turning it into dust, and we planted a beautiful, bright flower garden in its place so little Leo could run safely in the green grass. We ripped out every single piece of her expensive antique furniture and threw it directly into a massive commercial dumpster. We completely remodeled the grand ballroom where she used to host her cartel associates, turning it into a massive indoor playroom filled with sunlight and toys. Diane pressed her trembling hands against the thick glass, her eyes locked entirely on the smiling face of the powerful woman she had tried to destroy. A single tear of absolute agonizing defeat rolled down her hollow, wrinkled cheek. I leaned slightly closer to the metal speaker grill, preparing to deliver the final lethal blow to her massive sociopathic ego. I told her we had one final problem when we renovated the massive estate. The long, sweeping driveway leading up to the main house was cracked and outdated, so we decided to pave a brand new one. I looked deeply into her terrified eyes and told her exactly how we funded that specific construction project. I told her that the federal agents missed one tiny safety deposit box when they raided her antique business. It was a box containing the remaining legitimate assets and the physical deed to the storefront itself, which Warren managed to legally seize through a secondary civil forfeiture action before the cartel lawyers could hide it. I told her we took her entire life's work. We took the very high society antique business she used to pretend she was better than everyone else. We liquidated every single genuine vase, every oil painting, and the physical historic building itself. And we used every single penny of that money to pour the thick black asphalt for the new driveway. I stood up from the cold metal chair and looked down at her broken form. I told her that every single morning when Rachel drives her new luxury car out of the estate to take her son to his expensive private school, she is literally driving her heavy tires directly over the pulverized remains of her entire legacy. We did not just take her money and her freedom. We turned her entire proud existence into gravel for my family to walk on. I turned my back on the glass as she began to scream and pound her fists uselessly against the bulletproof barrier, leaving her completely alone in the dark. She heard the words about the driveway, and something inside her completely snapped. The last shred of her carefully constructed aristocratic sanity simply vanished into the sterile prison air. She stood up so violently that her heavy metal chair crashed backward onto the solid concrete floor. She slammed her clenched fists against the thick bulletproof glass over and over again, screaming in a completely impotent and absolute rage. Her voice was entirely muffled by the thick, transparent barrier, but the sheer agony in her face was crystal clear. She was mourning the permanent loss of her physical legacy and her stolen wealth far more than she ever mourned the loss of her own son. The two armed correctional officers immediately stepped forward, grabbing her firmly by the shoulders and forcefully dragging her away from the viewing window. She kicked and thrashed like a wild animal, completely stripped of all her fake high society elegance. I sat perfectly still in my chair, watching her bright orange jumpsuit disappear forever behind the heavy iron door. The lock clicked shut with a loud, resounding thud. That was the very last time I would ever see her face. The terrifying nightmare she had orchestrated was now entirely clinically and ruthlessly dismantled. I stood up from the cold metal chair and walked purposefully out of the visitor center. I moved smoothly through the final security checkpoints and pushed open the heavy exterior metal doors. The warm afternoon sunlight hit my face instantly, washing away the sterile chemical smell of the maximum security prison. The air out here was clean and entirely free. I walked across the massive barren asphalt parking lot to my heavy truck and climbed inside. Starting the powerful engine, I pulled out onto the long desert highway heading west toward the lush green coast of Seattle. The 3-hour drive gave me the quiet time I needed to finally process the absolute magnitude of what we had accomplished over the last 6 months. We did not just survive a targeted and vicious attack. We had completely inverted the entire power dynamic of our enemies. We took the absolute worst betrayal imaginable and engineered it into a permanent, unassailable fortress. The deeply corrupt legal system that Colin tried to use to bury my family was the exact same system we weaponized to legally strip them of absolutely everything they valued. Later that afternoon, I pulled off the main coastal highway and approached the grand entrance of our newly acquired property. The heavy wrought iron electronic gates swung open silently, recognizing the sensor in my vehicle and welcoming me home. I drove the truck very slowly up the long, winding path toward the main house. The thick black asphalt beneath my heavy tires was perfectly smooth and completely flawless. I thought about the crushed remains of the antique business buried deep within that pavement, and a profound sense of poetic justice settled quietly in my chest. We had literally paved our road to freedom using the financial ruins of the people who tried to destroy us. The massive estate itself looked absolutely breathtaking in the warm golden afternoon light. We had hired the best commercial landscape architects in the city to completely transform the expansive grounds. Lush, vibrant green lawns stretched out in every direction, bordered by beautiful flower beds that were currently in full, magnificent bloom. Where the dark, windowless concrete garage once stood, there was now a beautiful custom-built wooden pavilion surrounded by climbing white roses. There was absolutely no trace of the horrors that had occurred on this land. We had violently ripped the darkness out by its roots and planted pure, enduring light in its place. I parked the truck near the side entrance of the main house and walked around toward the expansive backyard. The sound of pure, joyful laughter echoed clearly across the open grass. I stopped near the edge of the stone patio and just watched them for a long moment. Rachel was running barefoot through the soft green grass, chasing little Leo through the spinning arcs of water from the garden sprinklers. She was wearing a simple yellow sundress, and her dark hair was completely soaked and shining brightly in the sun. She looked incredibly strong and radiantly healthy. The heavy iron padlock, the toxic military drugs, and the freezing concrete floor belonged to an entirely different lifetime. She caught Leo in her arms, lifting him high up into the warm air as he shrieked with absolute pure delight. She was no longer a terrified victim, relying on a deeply corrupt husband for her basic survival. She was the wealthy, independent executive trustee of a massive, legitimate real estate empire. She controlled her own destiny entirely, and she had the financial power to ensure her son would never want for anything in his entire life. I walked up the wide wooden steps of the wraparound porch and sat down heavily in a comfortable, cushioned wicker chair. A fresh pot of coffee was waiting on the small glass table next to me, just as Rachel always left it in the afternoons. I poured myself a hot cup and took a long, slow sip, letting the rich, dark flavor ground me completely in the present moment. I leaned back and closed my eyes for just a second, listening to the beautiful sound of my family playing safely in the distance. When I first received that strange, desperate instinct back in Britain, I simply wanted to cross the ocean to surprise my daughter and check on her well-being. I thought I was just coming to offer emotional support, or maybe help build a new room for the baby. I had absolutely no idea that I would be forced to navigate a deadly conspiracy tear down a violent narcotics syndicate and orchestrate the total financial and legal destruction of a senior city prosecutor. But a father does whatever the structural integrity of his family requires. You cannot build a safe home on top of toxic soil. You have to dig deep, remove the poison, and pour a completely new foundation. I did not just rescue my daughter and my young grandson from the dark ashes of their old life. We used those very ashes to mix the concrete for our new beginning. We rebuilt our family empire directly on top of the people who tried to bury us, and we made absolutely sure they could never rise again. Before I finish my coffee and go join them in the garden, I want to thank you for listening to my story. Please let me know what you thought about our journey in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. If you believe that true justice requires absolute strength and that the love of a parent can conquer the darkest of evils. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next story. If there is one profound lesson I have taken from this entire ordeal, it is that true strength is not measured by the volume of your voice or the titles you hold, but by the lengths you are willing to go to protect the people you love. Blood and marriage certificates do not automatically create a safe family. Mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and unconditional protection do. Never underestimate the quiet ones, and never mistake patience for weakness. When the corrupt systems of the world fail to protect your loved ones, you must have the courage to become the architect of your own justice and rebuild your life entirely on your own terms. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own stories of standing up to toxic family members in the comments below.